You may have heard the American idiom that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, credited to the oft-quoted Benjamin Franklin. This is especially true as it relates to designing a questionnaire to gather information that you plan to analyze later. If you think ahead now as to how you will analyze the data, you'll suffer from significantly fewer headaches later. To this end, we will focus on understanding variables and values, criteria to consider when designing and formatting questions, as well as how to implement those criteria, and content analysis of open-ended questions. This discussion will be easier to digest if you already have some understanding of the various survey question types. Let's start with defining what goes into a question. While it seems self-explanatory, it's easy to get lost. Later, in the statistical analysis stage, you will use the terms variables and values. A variable is really a question, often in shorthand form, and the values are all of the answer possibilities, or the response categories. Well, actually, a variable is what the question is really getting at. For example, you have a question that asks, how familiar are you with the Three Stooges? The variable would be familiarity with Three Stooges, a shorthand way to describe what the question is really getting at. Now, there are a variety of possible response options. Dichotomous, with only two responses, familiar or not familiar. Categorical, such as no experience with them, all the way to own their own movies. Some sort of scale, such as very familiar, somewhat familiar, not familiar, or on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being not at all familiar and 5 being extremely familiar. Or entirely open-ended, where the respondent answers in his or her own words. Looking forward to how you plan to analyze the data, you'll want to convert or code the words to numbers, with the exception of the open-ended responses. But even those are likely to be analyzed and converted to codes at a later time. Each of these answer possibilities are values. How you write or display the question will impact how easy it will be for you to input and analyze the data later. Think about how you will identify the variable number and the value labels, keeping in mind two criteria. First, number the questions in a way that makes sense for the person recording the data, whether it be an interviewer who is asking and recording the data, or a respondent answering questions via paper or web-based questionnaire. So the data collection method is important here. And second, consider how you will enter the data for later computer analysis. Look at these two questions. The first is pretty straightforward, so we can number it question 1. But how will the data be recorded? That's the first criterion. You can add check boxes if you want. Look at these two questions. The first is pretty straightforward, so let's number it question 1. But how will the data be recorded? That's the first criterion. You can add check boxes if you wish, or tell the respondent to circle the correct answer. Both of these options address the first criterion of having the question make sense to the person recording the data. But what about the second criterion, the one referring to how you will enter the data? Remember we talked about converting the response categories to numbers for data entry? It's much easier to type in 1, 2, and 3 than A, B, and C, and definitely much easier than typing in the actual response of not at all familiar. You can either number the responses now, or keep the numbering system in the back of your mind for when you actually enter the data. Regardless, for question 1, a response of somewhat familiar will be entered as a 2. But let's look at the next question. It's really 4 questions. Have you seen the Three Stooges on television? Yes or no? Have you seen them in a movie? Yes or no? Etc. 4 yes or no questions. But we want the respondent to think of it as one question, essentially tricking the respondent into thinking that the questionnaire is shorter than it actually is. So we would label the question stem, this part of the question, as question 2. But actually, these are all question 2. Question 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D. We can label it this way now, or just remember that later when we set up our data entry. Each one of these is a separate question. Now we need to convert the yeses and nos to 1s and 2s. For each of these questions, an answer of yes will be coded as a 1, and an answer of no will be coded as a 2. Again, you could set it up as checkboxes or circle the appropriate answer, in which case a response that is not checked or not circled would be interpreted as a no or a 2. Or you could ask the respondent to circle the 1 or the 2. Let's do a quick review on some other non-Three Stooges questions. This questionnaire has several questions, some set up as single questions and others that are multiple questions. Again, you see a question stem that leads into the multiple questions, and there are two examples of question stems here. Remember, we use the term variable as a shorthand way of identifying what the question is getting at. And then you have the answers or the responses for each question. In computer analysis terms, these are the values for each of the variables. Now, question 4 is an example of a multiple choice question where the respondent should only choose one answer from several provided. Question 3 is an example of an open-ended question, and we'll talk about how to handle this type of question a bit later. Question 5 is also an open-ended question, but in this case the response will be a number. And you should now know how to handle the questions that are really multiple questions. In this example, questions 1 and 2. This type of question could be called a multiple response question, if you think about it as allowing respondents to choose more than one answer to a question. In fact, if you really think about it, this question could be thought of as a check all that apply. One more thing before we leave these questions. Any question that offers only two possible responses, as in the case of question 1 and 2, that would be yes and no, these are called dichotomous questions. And the prefix di in Greek means two, just like the prefix bi in Latin does. Once you have the questions, you'll want to format them for the data collection method you are planning to use. You can ask the same question, but display it in different ways. Now, I'm hoping that some of this is redundant with what we've already talked about, but there will likely be some new information here. Let's go back to our Three Stooges example. For interviewer-administered surveys, such as a phone survey, you might ask the question this way. You can show the refusal category since the respondent will not see it, only the interviewer. And if you had an undecided or don't know category, you could also have the code put in here. Now, you wouldn't want the respondent to see it, otherwise the number of people answering with undecided would be higher, and normally you want to force a choice. The interviewer can just circle the number of the stated response, and you can and often must provide specific instructions to interviewers. If I were to ask this question on a phone survey without the interviewer instructions included, I might say, how familiar are you with the Three Stooges? And now the respondent would not know how to answer the question. For a self-administered survey, one that the respondent will see, you could do the same question this way. Now you can replace the check boxes with numbers, or tell the respondent to circle the response. But notice that you don't provide the refuse category here. If the respondent doesn't answer the question, it can, by default, be considered a refusal. And you can also save space by displaying the question this way. Let's go next to the multiple response question. As we said earlier, it's really 4 questions. For an interviewer-administered survey, you could put all the information in so that it would be easier for the interviewer to record and ultimately easier for you to key into a data file later. For a self-administered survey, such as a written questionnaire or a web-based survey, you might not want to show the coding scheme. You could replace the checkboxes in this example with the words yes and no, asking the respondent to circle the appropriate answer. And you may need to modify the question wording a bit. Now look at these two questions. You've probably noticed that, depending upon the answer to question 1, question 2 does not apply. The names for this type of question vary. It could be called a filter, contingency, branch, or a skip question. But its purpose is the same, to allow respondents to skip around questions that don't apply to them. In this case, you will need to give instructions on what to do for both the interviewer and the respondent. If you are conducting the survey via internet, you can program in the instructions or the branch criteria, but it will be important to think through the page breaks. Even if you program a branch around question 2 based upon a not at all familiar answer in question 1, if you don't insert a page break between question 1 and question 2, the respondent will be confused. Let's go back one more time to this question 2, which you now know is made up of 4 dichotomous questions. You could also think of this format as a matrix question. You can use this matrix format for non-dichotomous questions as well. In fact, they're often used for rating scale questions. Say you wanted to follow up this question with an assessment of the Three Stooges' strengths and weaknesses. You could have a series of statements, asking respondents to answer each statement as excellent, good, fair, or poor. In this case, you could format it like question 2, but with more than the yes-no responses. So rather than having 4 dichotomous questions, as in question 2, you have 4 multiple response questions in question 3, set up in a matrix format. This matrix format can be used for more than rating scales, such as a Likert or Likert style question, a semantic differential question, or even a version of the dichotomous question. Notice that in this version, there are really more than 3 sub-questions. It is really, have you seen the Three Stooges on television? Yes or no. At a comedy club? Yes or no, etc. And then you go through the same series again for Cheech and Chong, and again for Penn and Teller. One last note before we leave rating scales, and that has to do with the order you display the ratings versus the order that you will use for statistical analysis. For this example, we will use the 4-point scale excellent, good, fair, or poor. If you ask the question by reading excellent as the first possible response and you order the answers or values in the order you said them, you'll note that the lower the number, the more positive the response. Assuming you plan to calculate a mean on this question, you might end up with a mean of 1.27 on a 4-point scale. Now, most of us like to think of 4-point scales like grade point averages. The higher the mean, the better. But in this case, with excellent valued at 1, the lower the mean, the better. A simple way to fix this is to continue asking the question in the same way, but order the responses in reverse order. That way, when you calculate the mean later, you will end up with a mean that looks like the way we tend to think of them. The higher the mean, the more positive the response. I said I would get back to how to deal with open-ended questions, so here we go. While this discussion is more appropriately placed in data entry and computer analysis, it makes sense to discuss it here as it may help you determine if you really want an open-ended question and how you will eventually use the resulting answers. The sample question is, what was the last ebook you have read? That could result in a wide variety of responses. But these are very hard to analyze unless you first conduct a content analysis. This involves reviewing the answers and then developing categories that encompass the themes of those responses. Looking at this list, I might develop categories such as classic literature, fiction, nonfiction, business and money, and other. My next step is to assign numbers to each of these categories. Note that for other, I used a high number of 50. That's because as I review more answers, I might come up with more categories and could easily add those in without compromising my numbering scheme. Now it's time to go back through the answers and assign the code for the appropriate category. Now, to be honest, I had to look up what type of book Defending Jacob is. It's a legal thriller. I couldn't code it until I knew what it was, and you might have to do something similar before you can code a response. Now, ideally, this process should be conducted independently by at least 2 different people, or coders, to make sure that the responses are coded correctly and consistently. The concept is called intercoder reliability, meaning we want to make sure that, regardless of who did the coding, the resulting decisions are the same. Now that you have the codes assigned, you can run statistical analyses to determine which type of books are read as ebooks. Processing time. What is the difference between a variable and a value? Think of a question you might ask on a telephone survey. How might you adjust it to be used in a written questionnaire? And what is content analysis, and for what type of question would you be likely to use it? I hope that this information will act as what Benjamin Franklin called the ounce of prevention, resulting in significantly fewer pain reliever pills to cure the headaches that you may have later when you're analyzing the data that you've collected with your questionnaire.